Hello, my name is Neil Leach, and I would like to offer you today some reflections on my journey with MidJourney. I want to compare it to two other platforms that I've been using, DreamStudio AI and DALL-E 2, and offer also a few theoretical reflections about what the implications are of these new platforms from a theoretical perspective. Let me start with this particular image from that I was generated with DreamStudio AI. Futuristic Indian temple, and it points towards the real potential of these platforms in shocking you and surprising you with something novel and actually often really quite inspirational. My problem in some senses with MidJourney itself, with DreamStudio itself, is that it's not so easy to iterate. It's based on the logic of stable diffusion. It uses stable diffusion. I'm sure there are other platforms that will become available also using the same platform that will allow you to iterate. But without iterating, you simply have one shot at it. You can't develop it further. I think part of the logic of being a designer is to work with something, to work through a number of different iterations and to see how your own design ability can somehow coax it into some particular direction. It reminds me in some sense of what it's like to be a designer, to teach design. You're working with a student, you can't control the student, but you can at least coax it in a certain direction, that student in a certain direction, by suggesting certain things. With MidJourney, you can do that, not so with these other platforms that don't allow for iteration. But I'd also say, and so important with these platforms is the notion of the prompt itself. You have to become a prompt engineer. You have to be able to describe something, and the prompt becomes vital, the order of the words and everything, and that's the kind of thing you have to focus on. In this particular prompt, I use the term oyster, opalesque, and also the aurora borealis to try and open up the possibility. I try and use non-architectural terms, almost like the grit in an oyster itself, that might destabilize things and produce something that you wouldn't have expected, that opens architecture up to other forms of expression. At least that's what I found with my operation. DreamStudio then can shock you, can surprise you. It becomes a prompt that makes you think about things. It also, in some sense, opens up your imagination. It's a kind of, let's call it a sketching tool that can begin to be part of the process at the very beginning to open up the possibilities of it. I've used it also to look at the city, in this case, a city of 1,000 towers. And frankly, it's not bad. The problem again, though, is I can't iterate it. I can't take it any further. And that, to my mind, is a deep frustration. Anyone perhaps could do this, but a designer wants to work with it and take it into new directions. Also, I've tried using DALL-E 2, in this case, also looking at the city. In some sense, DALL-E you can iterate, but you lose the resolution, it seems, after the first iteration, and it's not so satisfactory. These models, of course, are based on a sort of very generic of a huge uploaded data set that don't necessarily apply to particular things, and you can't necessarily guide it too well. It doesn't necessarily recognize certain things. One of the limitations of these data sets is they're not very good at dealing with things like fingers and faces. And it was surprising to me when I tried this out, partly as a kind of a joke, really. I was trying to look for Boris Johnson in the style of William Hogarth, and it wouldn't let me use Boris Johnson because you can't use personal names, but I used the expression a former British Prime Minister with unkempt hair, and it gave me this. Now, there's something quite suspicious about this, although it does come out as a rather remarkable portrait, and that is the fact that the face is so perfect. And I think what happens often with DALL-E is that they have set faces that keep reappearing everywhere. I've been far more taken by MidJourney. MidJourney is something absolutely different, and it's really, it relates very much to the way we operate as designers. We iterate, we go through things, we challenge things, we take things in certain directions. It is a process born of the affordance of the tool itself. And what is so important here, of course, is the use of the prompt. We have to become prompt engineers. We have to be very precise in how we use things. I used the expression Blade Runner for this particular one. It didn't recognize Blade Runner, but clearly it recognized the notion of the blade itself. Interestingly, also, Zaha Hadid is someone that it does recognize, at least reasonably well. And because there's so much information about Zaha Hadid out there on the internet. what these models are essentially doing are linking captions or text to images via captions. And therefore, if there are images of a particular architect, or if their name is there very obviously, it will do it. It will find that and be relatively convincing. Less so in the case of Odile Deck. A colleague of mine, Aaron Hartzman, was working on that, and he struggled to really get anything that looked anything like Odile Deck. In fact, the designs that came out were in some ways the precise opposite of Odile Deck. They weren't colorful, they weren't organic, they were much more rectilinear in some ways. So iteration is really the thing that you can do to kind of take it further, and you have to iterate many times, 15, 20, 25 times, even more perhaps sometimes. And then suddenly something emerges out of the screen, as it were, and it looks remarkable. This one in particular I was taken by. It is accidental in some senses. It's accidental, it wasn't necessarily intended, but it becomes inspirational for us, and we can take it and work with it as designers and incorporate it into design. Nor does it have to be necessarily the work of Zaha Hadid. I used in this case the prompt that included the word minimalist villa, and you can see how well it does this. Minimalist villa in the Swiss Alps. The mountains in the background are very convincing, and it comes up with things called novel arrangements that I would never have thought of myself, which is hugely suggestive. And also, it's very good at handling not only the profile of the mountains in the background, but also the reflection, or at least the impression of the reflection. Don't think this is accurate, because this doesn't understand the three-dimensionality of the form itself. It's simply giving an impression, but is a pretty effective impression. I then went from the mountains to the desert, and it came up with this extraordinary result for a villa in the desert with a kind of tray above the villa with a kind of beach on it that I wouldn't have imagined. And then here, well, you get a reflection, or is it a view through? Don't ask too many questions, but it is something kind of interesting. This is, I think, has a really important role to play in terms of the interaction between AI and architecture. I was the author of this book that came out in December in 2021 in the UK, and a few months later in the States and elsewhere, Architecture in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, an Introduction to AI for Architects, which was probably the first of the kind of readily available books on AI in the English language. It's the first book that, for example, that's available on Amazon. The challenge, however, when working in the field from the very early time, was the fact that there was very little to talk about, very little to illustrate with. On the front cover, we have an illustration that was done by Refik Anadol, based on a data set of work of Zaha Hadid architects, and it was produced in 2019, and probably was the first ever GAN-generated image of a design. GAN meaning generative adversarial networks. More recently, this has been taken further, and this is the work of Deep Himmelblau for Corp Himmelblau, masterminded by Daniel Bolojab, who is the great genius, I say, of AI and architecture. And this is where it was a state of the art, as it were, until these diffusion platforms came along. And this is not bad, but in some sense, this is all that we could do until this particular time. Architects cannot be convinced of anything until they've seen visual evidence of that. So for the issue of the architectural design that I guest edited with Matthias Del Campo that came out a few months later, Machine Hallucinations, we put that on the front cover of the book. But what's happened now, of course, is that suddenly something has appeared that really architects can relate to, because it's visual, highly visual, and very well articulated. This was a design for a hotel room in the style of Zaha Hadid architects that shocked even those working for Zaha Hadid architects themselves. You can see how the reflection's working here on the side here, how the lighting's working, and somehow it generated these pictures for the wall that on its own, remarkable, really quite remarkable. So all of a sudden we can visualize something, and it gives us some sense of a glimpse of the real potential of AI. In some senses, it doesn't do it. If you look very closely, it doesn't make complete sense. You can kind of get a sense of it. It's suggestive, and you can take it and intervene yourself and read it in certain ways. But looking at it very closely, such as this bed here, you can think, well, you begin to realize that actually it doesn't really make complete sense, but doesn't matter. It draws us in because it invites us to start interpreting it, and that's, I think, the vital point that it makes. So here we have an interior, another interior by Zaha Hadid that's really involving you. What I would say is that the important thing is not that whether this is really going to be a game change in and of itself. It is a sketching tool, and it doesn't understand 3 dimensions and so on. We need to take it further. But it is important as it wakes a wake-up call for architects that suggests the possibility of what it's going to do in the future. And already there is software that is being prepared, that is in the pipeline of production, as it were, that will come out in 3 to 5 years' time, that will do extraordinary things. The whole production of a design of a building will start from data and go straight to fabrication on one seamless platform, and it will be able to tell us about performances, about building codes, about all those restrictions and things. It can tell us about the cost, the performance, the structural performance, the environmental performance, and everything will already be conforming to those requirements. That there will be an absolute revolution in the production of architecture, and this is a kind of wake-up call. That work's going on now, and you could maybe compare it, say, to the idea of an iceberg. You can see the top 10% of an iceberg, but 90% is below the water. And that kind of visual reference, I think, is important for architects. They need to see something, but they also need to be aware that there are other things that are happening behind the scenes that are really going to be changing architecture in a radical way in 3 to 5 years' time. Architecture won't be the same. BIM will be out the window. Everything will be in a coherent, seamless platform. We will, instead of going from a Maya sketch to a Rhino drawing to BIM and so on, everything will be on a single platform. It will be a major revolution in the production of architecture itself. I always appreciate the work of Sebastian Errázuriz and Sebastian Studio. He always puts out these very provocative comments. He put out a comment about why artists deny that AI could replace them. He also made a previous comment about how architects were going to go out of work. And that's something that I'm only too aware of myself, because I'm working on that area. I'm looking at both of the good side, the positive side of AI, and also the dark side of AI. My point is not that AI is evil in and of itself. No tool is inherently evil. You can murder someone with a kitchen knife, but you can also use it to cut up your vegetables. Surveillance could be, facial recognition could be used by a repressive regime. It can also be used to open up your iPhone. There's nothing inherently evil about AI, despite all the people who criticize it in some way. The problem is really who is using it and for what. Nonetheless, the real challenge, I think, of AI is that it is incredibly capable. And in some senses, this has, I think, alerted architects to the fact that there is something that can produce more creative solutions than they can. They have a glimpse that there is something out there that is more powerful. And I think we need to be aware that these things are going to get stronger and stronger and become more and more capable. These are some furniture designs that I generated. Again, I used, in the prompt itself, I used other things to kind of, as it were, grit in the oyster to go and open up these things. In this case, it was a particular frog, poisonous frog from the Amazon that has especially colorful skin. And this was kind of intervening and opening up this thing, but really, in a sense, very convincingly. This kind of the 3-dimensional modeling of this, the kind of the feeling you get from it is remarkable, and it shocks people. All of a sudden, you can see that this machine that has no consciousness, doesn't know what it is doing, can nonetheless produce something that is challenging us, maybe even more creative than we are, or seemingly creative than we are, producing these designs that we wouldn't have imagined ourselves. That's the point. This whole new platform is itself a wake-up call for architects. Suddenly we can glimpse something, and it's a glimpse of what is going to happen in the future in a much more radical way. These particular sofas I produced were, I used a shark in the prompt, which maybe suggests some of the textures that it produced, but really remarkable, astonishing things that in a sense prompt us. We give it prompts, but it prompts us to think in new ways about how we might imagine the furniture of the future. One of the terms that I use to try and understand this new concept is the notion that J.J. Gibson comes up with the notion of an affordance. The idea that actually, as I was mentioning before, no tool is necessarily good or bad, but you can use it in certain sort of ways. And that's the point. It doesn't control what you do. To subscribe to that would be to subscribe to the logic of technological determinism, as though any tool was necessarily good or bad. It's not. But there are certain affordances of the tool that allow you to do certain things and aren't very good at others. So you find yourself, as you're exploring MidJourney, you trying to explore the more positive, the more useful aspects of what it can do, and steering away from the things it can't do so well. I was able to generate these towers, but often it's not so difficult, not so easy to generate these towers. But you can get a glimpse of the city of the future. Actually, I don't think the city of the future will be like this so much as a city that is controlled by AI, but nonetheless, from a kind of science fiction point of view, you can really generate things that are truly, truly astonishing. At the other end of the scale, you can start generating more kind of traditional architectures. This was a study that I did on a series of studies I did on Iranian architecture, which really caused a stir in Iran. Architects were really quite struck by that. They were telling me it wasn't totally realistic, but nonetheless, they were blown away by the detail of this. And for sure, it is remarkable. And this is one of the first of the studies that was done on historical architecture. You can now see the Instagram flooded by these kind of studies, and they become very, very popular. But there is something a little bit suspicious, I have to say, about this, in the sense that when I started working on Arabesque architecture, moving from Iran to the Arab world, something very similar started appearing. It's as though there is some template that is embedded into the system that controls it and allows it to come up with these kind of designs. I wonder whether I were to go and explore the possibility of the interior of a Brunelleschi church from the Renaissance, whether I wouldn't find something similar emerging. Nonetheless, it does do these things in a very interesting way, and it does shock people. How is it possible for you to do this? And it shocks us. It makes us aware of our own limitations. Would we have thought of those things? It's opening up, to my mind, a new chapter in all sorts of ways, even though it is simply, I would say, a sketching tool. Another comment from Sebastian Erasmus, why the Turing test will be passed in the arts first, as though computers will be best at art than other things. I don't agree with this particular comment. I think that in some senses, the Turing test has been passed, first of all, in certain games, in chess, and particularly in the game of Go. The match in 2016 against Lisa Doll, that's where the computer proved itself to be most proficient. And the real problem what we're doing right now is it's not the computer, it's not AI on its own. What we're getting now is human beings using AI as an extension, as a kind of prosthesis of their own kind of imagination. We can talk about this maybe in terms of extended intelligence or intelligence augmentation, but it's not, for the moment at any rate, AI operating autonomously. You are working with a tool that opens things up, that suggests things to you. Whenever I'm working in this field, I always try and avoid simple architectural terms and try and use expressions like cocoons or pods or zones. And it reminds me of the way in which I used to operate in the design studio from the very beginning, where I was trying to get my students to reconceptualize their designs by using different expressions. Don't think of a room, think of a cocoon or a pod. Don't think of an area, think of a zone, and so on. And for sure, it starts producing some astonishing results, always kind of way shocking you with what it is doing. These were cryogenic pods that I produced that came right out of the computer at me and really shocked me in many ways. It's also surprisingly good at dealing with materials. Materials, in other words, that you wouldn't have thought it would be very good at dealing with. After all, the computer operates in the completely immaterial domain of computation, whereas materials belong to, obviously, material world. And yet it is able to simulate this in an astonishing way. This was a study of some pebbles that I did that shocked me. How was it able to give such a realistic impression of pebbles? And that is pervasive within the explorations that I've been doing, especially looking at these kind of cocoons and things, and you get this kind of marble-esque kind of feeling of the materials involved, which is really quite remarkable and quite suggestive. It's almost like you could almost pick them up and have a sense of what they might feel like.
So there's something I think that is extraordinary, despite its immateriality, AI is able to produce some extraordinary material compositions that really are quite remarkable. This is obviously marble, but the exquisite details that it begins to bring in can be truly, truly impressive and very, very surprising in the way that it operates. I want to here refer to something that I said some time ago in the context of computational design. It seems to me that we've already begun to sort of shift in the way that we operate in terms of our designs, our approach towards design. The notion of the search has become increasingly important. And when we're working computationally, it's to do with how we might define the algorithm and how the search space for that algorithm. And then what we get basically is a series of outcomes, not design so much as outcomes. And then the challenge really is to then evaluate and appraise those outcomes. It's as though we've shifted in the way that we operate, and in some ways parallel to the way that we take photographs these days. In the old days, you'd set up your camera for one precise shot, and you had to get it right. Now you take a whole bunch of sample shots, so you go through, you select them, then you might go and filter them in certain sort of ways until you get the result that you wanted. But the shift is from the idea of the genius author producing something to searching through a range of suggestions. Not only does it challenge the notion of the genius of the architect designer and the originality of the work of art, but it also suggests that if there is any creativity in the design process, it should lie first in defining the constraints that generate the range of possible solutions to a problem, and secondly, in developing an effective method of filtering and evaluating them. This, it seems, is what's happening here with prompt engineering. Instead of defining things through an algorithm, you're defining things through prompts, and then you are effectively evaluating them. And what is remarkable about human beings is the way how quickly we can evaluate something. You take a sip of a cocktail and you know if you like it instantly. You taste some food, you know immediately. And if you see an image, it's almost instantaneous. So it really combines that capacity of the computer to search through possible solutions beyond the range that we could imagine with our very human abilities to be able to appreciate and to understand these things. So in some ways, what we're getting then is an incredible sort of form of a kind of prosthesis to the human imagination, some very useful device that can open up and explore things beyond our range of what we would otherwise think about, and changing in many ways the role of the designer from this genius person who only probably has a limited range of possibilities to someone who opens up in many sort of ways. I talk about this in my work in terms of how human beings are a bit like chess players. They tend to sort of operate only in certain sort of moves. They're constrained in some senses by their habits and by their character, and they can't move beyond this. What this is doing is prompting us, suggesting us, and telling us that there are other options out there that we simply hadn't imagined for ourselves. So it's opening up in some ways a whole new realm of the imagination where we can, as designers, explore new things. I think it's going to lead to a whole burst of kind of a creative energy, of an attention to some detail, to almost Baroque techniques and so on. I'm sure that that's going to be the result of all this new thing. It's only a sketching tool, but nonetheless, it is hugely, hugely suggestive of a possible future world. I want to go back to the previous model that I mentioned earlier, the generative adversarial network, which was the model that is still being used, but it was almost the only model. It was the dominant model until the arrival of these diffusion platforms. Now, the way that a GAN, generative adversarial network, operates, and there are many of them, there's a whole zoo of different GANs, just as there's a whole zoo of different diffusion platforms now. The way that it works is there are two competing neural networks. There is a generator that is generating an image out of random noise, and then a discriminator that is judging that image against a training set to see if it's convinced by it or not. It's a bit like, let's say, an art forger trying to produce a fake Van Gogh, and then an art critic trying to decide whether or not it's convincing Van Gogh. Now, that's an interesting sort of model, and what happens, they train each other. And we can see eventually how the discriminator forces the generator to improve its output until it produces something convincing. But what is often overlooked in this model is the fact that the discriminator itself is being trained. It's being trained by the generator, by the creativity, as it were, of the generator, and that is changing the discriminator. If you think about it in terms of the many sort of philosophers, people like Sanford Quinterman or DeLanda, Ben Bratton, Mark Cousins, and so on, who've been working in the field of architectural design as critics, one of the reasons why they're interested in architecture is the very creativity of architects themselves. And we shouldn't overlook the fact that actually, just as the generator is becoming more critical, so the discriminator is becoming more creative in its outlook. My point is that precisely this is the model that we're talking about here. In a sense, that what is happening is that MidJourney is the generator. It's throwing out these things, these possibilities, and we are judging them. Do we like them or do we not? So we are becoming the discriminator, but it's also beginning to suggest there is a new kind of hybrid designer that is appearing, that has the potential to appear. That is to say, the kind of critic, the creative critic, who doesn't need to know how to use certain software tools such as Grasshopper or whatever, but is able to bypass that, generate these images, and then use that discerning capacity that they build up over the years to become some kind of designer themselves. That, at any rate, is partly what I found. I myself, I'm trained as an architect. I am an architect. I'm a registered architect, but I've been a theorist. I haven't designed a building or run a practice for many years, and yet I draw upon that capacity to teach and design studio and to operate as a critic to be able to use these techniques and become a kind of designer again. So what we're seeing then is, I think, a new emerging form of practice where we are, in some senses, democratizing design, opening it up in new ways, and in a way that I think that is just beginning to point towards something. I want to return here to the metaphor of the iceberg because this is so important. We are shocked by the visual, the visual quality of this, of what's being produced by MidJourney and these other platforms. We are shocked by that. It is a wake-up call, and we needed the visual image to shock us into that. But the logic of the visual also goes beyond that. We are seeing just the tip of the iceberg. In years to come, the whole way in which we operate as architects is going to be challenged by this. It's going to be changed and transformed, not by MidJourney, but by a series of other software tools that are in production right now and that will be released very soon. Architecture will not be the same again. We need to adapt in order to survive, because if we stay the same, we'll be overtaken by these new technologies. It seems to me that now we are at a crucial moment, a revolution in the whole design world, not just architecture, but all forms of design, whereby things are going to change. And this is a kind of harbinger of change. It's appeared before even I imagined it was appeared. I was telling people about the AI revolution. It's going to happen, and suddenly it is here. It's only a sketching tool, but trust me, there is much more that is behind there, that is there. This is the beginning of a chapter. How is it going to change architectural education and the architectural profession? Well, we don't know quite yet, but we know it's going to change. It's a question really of watch this space. And what I would recommend to you is to follow some of the production that's going on here. On my own Instagram account, I have Neil Leach 14. I have my work, but there are many others who are working there. There was a session that we had on Digital Futures World, looking at these diffusion platforms a few weeks ago. On Digital Futures International, we also have a series of recordings and so on of different events that we've held. The world is changing, and I think it's up to us to change with that world. And if there's anything that designers have to design right now, it's not buildings, it's not products, it's their future. We need to be able to harness the possibilities, the affordances of these new tools, and to explore it, to go down the tunnel, as it were, of MidJourney, to come out the other end, or to step through the looking glass. This is an Alice in Wonderland world where there is something on the other side that is truly magical and truly special. We ignore it at our peril. This is something very special we need to pay attention to.